If the polls are to be believed, and there are a lot of them, Pierre Poilievre is poised to be Canada's next prime minister. As leader of the Conservative Party since 2022, he has quickly become the most formidable of the three Tory leaders to challenge Justin Trudeau for the country's top elected office. While there's little we don't know about Trudeau by now, the same can't be said about Poilievre. Who is he? What motivates him? What kind of prime minister would he be? The author of a new book, likely the first of many, aims to start that conversation. Here to talk about Pierre Poilievre, A Political Life, is journalist and broadcaster Andrew Lawton. What made you write the book? Why Poilievre and why now?
I think the why now is because Canadians are going to be faced very soon with a critical decision at the polls on who to vote for and which party. So I think in general, Canadians benefit well from being informed about who their leaders are. Justin Trudeau had a level of notoriety when he was seeking the premiership of Canada that Poilievre doesn't have to the same extent. But beyond that, I also thought there was something very fascinating about Poilievre as a figure in Canadian politics. I started thinking about this when I saw during the leadership race these rallies he was holding that were getting, in some cases, thousands and thousands of people out, people who had never been conservative before, some people who had never been interested in politics before. And it was clear that something different was happening. And I wanted to explore why that was and why he's managed to have such momentum in a very apathetic political culture at times.
Now, for many, this will be the first time learning Poilievre's backstory. He's the son of a single mother, adopted by two teachers in Calgary. Pretty regular type stuff so far. Was there anything in his background that surprised you?
I would say that the surprise really came from the consistency that he's had over the years about what he cares about. The fact that he was writing letters to the editor as a teenager and op-eds in the Calgary Herald and essays in university that were talking about the very same themes he's talking about now. Things like freedom as being this all-encompassing, all-important concept in politics, the idea of fiscal conservatism, of getting government out of the way. These are things that he has been stable and consistent on for not even just his time as an MP, but going back to his adolescence. And in an era of political flip-flops, I found that quite surprising.
Now, an important part of Poilievre's origin story, if we want to call it that, is his entry into the If I Were Prime Minister essay contest. Here's someone from a very young age who's had his eyes set on the prize. Was that surprising to you, or it tracks pretty well with what we know about him so far?
So this was actually an essay contest, and the prompt was, as Prime Minister, I would. And it was basically for young Canadians to really put their ideas forward for a country. So that he would enter such a contest was not a big surprise. That he was interested in that was not something that I found all that shocking. But I go back to that consistency point and how he was talking about things in that would not be out of place in his campaign speeches now. I found that quite fascinating. And even some of the language is paralleled between what was in that essay and what he was talking about when he announced his leadership bid in 2022. I will say the one thing that didn't stand the test of time in that was he had this little section on term limits and why MPs shouldn't serve more than 2 terms. And of course, 7 terms later, he's still in politics. But apart from that, it's held up remarkably well.
And running for number 8 next year, I imagine. Do you think the career politician tag is a hindrance? Is it something that he kind of quietly resents?
That's an interesting question. And had I interviewed him for the book, I would have asked him about that, not as a criticism, but just when did your mind change? When did you become comfortable enough to do this for a long period of time? One theory I advance in the book on this is that when you go into politics, you conceptualize a term as being 4 years, because that's what the typical order of things in a majority government. But his first term was a minority. The government lasted less than 2 years. His second term was a minority, which the government lasted 2 years. His third term, another minority, this time a little bit longer. So the idea of 2 terms in that dynamic is different than it might have been when he first set out on that path. And I think that probably weighed on it a bit.
Now, Poilievre made his bones as something of an attack dog in the House, like when he was the parliamentary secretary for Prime Minister Harper. He remains that scrappy debater even today, be it during question period or even with individual reporters. Do you see him softening that part of his personality if he becomes prime minister? Because it's more of an opposition leader kind of stance.
Yeah, the scrappiness is working for him right now. And I don't expect we'll see him let up on it between now and the election. As prime minister, I think there's probably going to be a different tone because who are you opposing? You're the guy everyone else is opposing. So maybe he'll be a little bit scrappy when he's responding to whatever the opposition throws at him, or certainly to the media. I think we've seen that he's not going to treat journalists as being this sacred cow that are above criticism themselves. So I think we'll certainly see that. And it's important to note that people around him that I spoke to said that isn't an act. That's just who he is. So it's not a persona. So in that sense, there's nothing to keep up. It's just the way he engages.
Now, I'm wondering if the popularity that he enjoys now is a reflection of him and his policies, or is it more of a comment on what is, frankly, a tired and deeply unpopular Liberal government right now?
I don't think you can separate Poilievre's success and momentum from the general discontent in Canada. I think they're both related. There's obviously a time and a place and a context in which he's the leader, but you also need to have the right person to seize that context. For example, I think there was a fair bit of frustration and discontent with the Liberals in 2021. Aaron O'Toole wasn't able to take that across the finish line. Pierre Poilievre maybe would be on track to win no matter what. I think the Conservatives could, put up the neighbor dog Fido and perhaps still do very well. But the numbers that he's posting in polls, the size of the lead suggests he himself is doing something and the party around him is doing something that goes beyond that. And I think that the book explores that a little bit because you obviously have to have a momentum there to be able to do what he's doing, but you have to have the right kind of message to seize that. And I think that's one thing he's clearly doing.
And you touched upon something there. Aaron O'Toole had certainly plenty of things to work with and still didn't manage to put it past the goal line.
Yes, and Aaron O'Toole also had a much greater level of discontent within his party. I mean, Conservatives have gotten very unforgiving with their leaders in recent years. The last two leaders lost one election and were out the door. If that same rule applied to Stephen Harper, he would have been out after 2004 and not had a chance to form government in 2006. But there doesn't seem to be the fracture within the Poilievre Conservative caucus that we've seen beforehand. There was a lot more unity, and I think a lot of that has come from the mandate he got. He didn't narrowly win the leadership. He won it on the first ballot really decisively, and from the moment he got in the race, there wasn't really a formidable challenger to him.
It's an interesting contrast that you bring up, too, because I believe Andrew Scheer won on the 13th ballot, so very much a consensus choice eventually, but a very different path for Mr. Poilievre, for sure.
Yeah, and by a hair. And even Aaron O'Toole, it was a smaller field. You didn't have the 13 candidates or 14 candidates in there, but he only won in part because he was pushed over the edge by an overwhelming percentage of the social conservatives in the party who had voted for Derek Sloan and Leslyn Lewis beforehand and then picked him as the lesser of evils over Peter MacKay. So the fact that Poilievre doesn't have as tenuous a coalition in the party, I think really works to his advantage, and he's been able to do a lot more with it. But it also means the stakes are higher for him if he forms government. People have very, very high expectations of what he's to do and what they want him to do if he wins.
Now, one of the knocks against Poilievre, or maybe it's a plus, depending on your perspective, is that he often communicates in nicknames, slogans, catchphrases. So we have Axe the Tax, Just Inflation, and my personal favorite, the have-nots versus the have-yachts. Is that a fair criticism, or perhaps just sour grapes at an effective communication strategy?
Again, I mean, it's tough whenever I get a question like that. It's a tough thing because I look at the polls and I say, well, whatever he's doing is clearly working to some extent or not hurting. But one thing I will say is that this is not new for him. I found slogans and nicknames he was giving as far back as like 2001 when he was taking aim at Joe Clark as Kyoto Joe, or the one that I really like, Jurassic Clark. just pointing him out to be like old and out of touch. So he comes by this in a way that has been, clearly a long time pastime of his. I think it's interesting because it's easy to look at that and say, okay, it's simplistic, it's dumbing down politics, and if people are cynical about politics, I get it. What I found interesting is the how he does that, because people around him said these things that seem off the cuff are not actually spontaneous. He's actually spent behind the scenes days, maybe even weeks, fine tuning this, running it by people, seeing what they think about it. So when he comes out and just seemingly says on a speech, oh, spike the hike or axe the tax, he's probably been with that, or it's been with him for quite some time when it comes out.
Now, one could argue that some of his positions are populist, even Trumpian, but what I found to be a really perceptive observation on your part is that you make the case that Poilievre is more a product of uniquely Canadian experiences, having grown up alongside politically, alongside Canadian conservatism. So the unity of the two conservative parties just happened around the same time that he entered politics, and that he had evolved along with that. So it's almost lazy to say that he's Trumpian, I think you're saying, because his evolution is over a much longer period of time.
Yeah, and he certainly has a much deeper political and philosophical conviction than Donald Trump does. I mean, Trump was a Democrat for most of his life, and then blinks one day and he's the face of the Republican Party, whereas Poilievre has helped build the conservative movement and the Conservative Party. On the term populist, I feel this often outside of the book gets a bit of a bad rap, because at its core, populism is really about policies that are for the people. And his roots in Alberta reform politics were very populist, but their version of populism was about grassroots democracy, things like voter recall, government accountability, these sorts of things. I think in that sense, he's very much held firm to a number of those things, and he has throughout his political career. But the problem with the word populist is that if you use it, it means different things to different people. So some people will take it as an inherently sinister value or outlook.
Now, Poilievre has said that it's his mission to make small C conservatives into big C conservatives. And as you observe, he must not only manage the expectations of the voting public, but also the notoriously fractious Conservative Party of Canada. Is he up to that challenge, do you think?
I think he has to be. So he doesn't really have a choice. But one thing I'll point out, because it's a very perceptive question, is the idea that victory makes a lot of things possible. Stephen Harper had to deal with this coalition, but because he won, a lot of people just kept their discontent quiet because they were in government. And when Andrew Scheer and Aaron O'Toole lose, people are very vocal about their frustration. So I think right now, most of the people in this party are rowing in the same direction and will continue to. Obviously, there are going to be little blips when, an MP, for example, pipes up on social conservative issues. It's happened this week. But I think if he wins, a lot of people will probably fall in line, at least for a time.
Now, the title of one of your recent videos is Trudeau Still Thinks He's Not Going Anywhere. Do you think Pierre Poilievre will be facing perhaps a different Liberal Party leader in the coming election?
Well, I don't think he wants to be. I think Justin Trudeau is probably Pierre Poilievre's greatest asset right now, although you can tell the Conservatives trying to hedge a bit by launching their attacks on Mark Carney, who's rumored to be one of the replacements of Justin Trudeau. But if I were Mark Carney, I'd be waiting in the wings right now for the Liberal Party to collapse so that he could come in. So I think Justin Trudeau himself has shown that he doesn't want to step down beforehand. His party doesn't really have a mechanism to get rid of him like the Conservatives do for their leader. So I think Poilievre is probably hoping that he'll stay firm there for at least the next year and a bit.
Now, early reviews of the book call it a sympathetic look at Pierre Poilievre. I'm wondering, who is this book for, and what do you hope the reader takes away from it?
So look, I am obviously, as a commentator, I lean right, and I don't hide that. But the book is very rooted in grounded in facts, and I was glad I did an interview with Paul Wells, who's not a conservative by any stretch, and he had asked me, why there was so little opinion, and I was glad that he thought that was the case, because that was my attempt. And I noted that the immigration minister Mark Miller had approvingly tweeted out an excerpt earlier on, so clearly the Liberals found something they liked in there. I think that there's obviously going to be people who like Poilievre that buy the book and read the book because they like him and want to learn more about him. But I wrote the book because I wanted to answer my own questions as a Canadian and as a journalist, and I figured other people would share those. So it's for people that like him, for people that are undecided about him, and maybe even for people who dislike him. And if he wins, I think there's a lot in there that will help people understand what's likely to come about from a Poilievre government. So, perhaps it's a little bit capitalistic on my part, but I think there's something in it for everyone.
The name of the book is Pierre Poilievre, A Political Life. It's published by Sutherland House. My thanks to author Andrew Lawton.
Thank you.